Hey everyone, welcome to lesson 2.4. This is on completing the square, part 2. So our essential question is, how would we convert a quadratic equation to vertex form if it has a leading coefficient? Leading coefficient. So you might be asking, what is a leading coefficient? Coefficient is a number in front of a variable, right? And the leading coefficient is the first one, or the one that's in front of x squared in particular. So the 4 there is the leading coefficient. So we want to know, how do we convert to vertex form if we have a number in front of x squared? And the process is very similar. We're still going to be completing the square, but we just have to add kind of an extra step to deal with the leading coefficient. So here we're going to go over our strategy and do an example, and then in the next video we'll go over a couple more examples. Okay, so our first step is to do something called factoring out the leading coefficient. So we're going to factor out leading coefficient from just the first two terms. So that's the x squared term and the x term. What does it mean to factor the leading coefficient out? Basically, we're undistributing it or dividing it out of those terms and moving it to the front. So here's what that looks like. What color do I want to use? Let's use blue, maybe. So our leading coefficient is, in this case, 2. So we're going to factor 2 out of the first two terms. So I'm going to move the 2 to the front, and then I'm going to ask myself, okay, if I undistribute a 2 from this term, what do I have left over? Or if I divide a 2 out of that term, what do I have left over? 2x squared divided by 2 just leaves x squared by itself. And then we're going to do it also from 16x, so undistribute a 2 or divide a 2 out, and we're left with 8x. And then we still have plus 85 hanging out at the end. Okay, so we factored out the leading coefficient from the first two terms. Our next step is to complete the square, and we're going to complete the square inside the parentheses. So we're going to use these two guys to complete the square. And we're doing this inside the parentheses. Okay, so let's do that. I'm going to open up a space inside the parentheses for me to add a number that will complete the square for us. And I'll move this down. Okay, so to complete the square, if we remember from our last lesson, we're taking our coefficient of x, we're dividing it in half, and then squaring it. So we have 8 divided by 2 squared, which gives us 4 squared, which is 16. So the number we add to complete the square is 16. Okay, we also probably remember from the last lesson that if we add a number to our function, we also need to subtract it so that we don't change the function overall. So we're going to do the same thing here. We're going to subtract a number, but we're going to do it outside the parentheses. And we have a little warning here. We have to be careful with the number that we subtract. The leading coefficient complicates this a little bit. So normally we would say, okay, we added 16, let's subtract 16. But in this case, since we added 16 inside this set of parentheses, and everything inside those parentheses is being multiplied by 2, what we've actually added to this function is 2 times 16, which equals 32. So because it's inside those parentheses that are being multiplied by 2, we've actually added 32 overall. So when I subtract a number, I need to make sure I subtract the full number that I added, which is actually 32. And then we still have plus 85 hanging out at the end. Running out of space a little bit. Okay, so the two kind of new things here are that we have to factor the leading coefficient out first, and when we subtract, we have to incorporate the leading coefficient into the number that we subtract. All right, now our last step is just like before. We're going to factor our perfect square that's inside the parentheses, and we're going to combine the like terms outside the parentheses. Okay, so we have 2 out front. By completing the square, we turn that thing in the parentheses into a perfect square. So we know it's going to be x plus or minus something squared. And to figure out what number that should be, it's always going to be our coefficient of x divided by 2. So that would be like 8 divided by 2, which is 4. So this factors to x plus 4 all squared. And then outside the parentheses, we're going to combine negative 32 and positive 85, which gives us plus 53. So there's our vertex form with a leading coefficient. All right, so that's a first example, and in the next video, we'll go through a few more examples of this.